So with that introduction, let me introduce to you Lieutenant Fretz of the Civil War.
Thank you. As Stu said, everybody knows about the monument. Most of us take it for granted as we drive about every day. I am Lieutenant Edwin Fretz. I grew up in Doylestown. At the time of the Civil War started, I had been for some 15 years. I was a printer by trade, and I'd been a printer right up the street here at Doylestown Democrat. Most of you know where that was because my boss, William W.H. Davis, was the owner and editor of the paper. He was also a staunch Democrat, and our office served as the office for the Bucks County Democratic Party. Not only for the Civil War, it served for over 100 years up until maybe about 20 years ago the Democratic Party moved their headquarters, but up until then that store right next to the state store was the Democratic Party headquarters. That's where we printed our paper. Davis himself had been an officer in the Army during the war with Mexico. So he was an experienced officer. And after the attack on Fort Sumter, when President Lincoln called for 500,000 volunteers, they needed experienced officers, and Davis was one. So he was breveted a colonel in the volunteer army and authorized to form a regiment of 1,000 soldiers with two stipulations. All 10 of his companies were to be recruited from Bucks County. It was to be strictly a Bucks County unit. And secondly, once organized, they were to drill and train in Doylestown, which was unusual. Usually the regiments trained and drilled at the state capitol. That was a political thing. That's a long story. But I was also a member of the Doylestown Guard, which was a militia company here in Doylestown. We drilled and trained every week right down here on South Clinton Street. And basically our militia company became Company A of the 104th Pennsylvania. Davis chose as his training site a big open field which was well west of the borough at that time. It had previously been the site of the county fairgrounds, and he named it Camp Lacey. I'm not going to go into a lot of the goings-ons of our regiment, but we'll mention that while we were out there 6 weeks drilling and training, Davis, having served in Mexico and fought in the campaign that involved Mexico City, semi-tropical climate down there, he recognized very well that the efficiency of his regiment was going to be determined by the health of his individual soldiers. So he was a stickler from day one. Every week he took us down to Neshaminy Creek and the whole regiment took a bath. And he also, before we left Doylestown, we were inoculated for smallpox, which was a rarity at that point in time. And it served us well because our first winter after we left Doylestown, we were in Washington, and they had a smallpox epidemic there that winter, and we only lost one man out of our 1,000-plus regiment because of Davis's foresight. We suffered a majority of our losses during the war in two particular battles. The first of these occurred on the last day of May in 1862, and our regiment was part of the Army of the Potomac at that time, then led by General George McClellan. The regiment had fought their way pretty much up the whole peninsula leading to Richmond, and we were only 5 miles outside of Richmond at the end of May. we envisioned going in the next day, hopefully taking Richmond, hopefully ending the war. Didn't turn out that way. There was a torrential rain shower that night, downpour. It rained all night, well into the next morning, and the Chickahominy River, which was behind us, overflowed, flooded, and isolated our Army Corps from the rest of the units. So when we were attacked later in the day, and this is an artist's depiction of that battle. I don't know if you can all see that. We were seriously outnumbered. We really got beat up on. We did well to prevent a complete disaster. This shows a particular aspect of that battle. The original is down in the Mercer Museum. But this phase of it, we counterattacked with a bayonet attack to temporarily stave off the rebels and keeping them from capturing the artillery was over on that part of the field. But in that battle, known as the Battle of Fair Oaks, or if you're from the south, it's the Battle of Seven Pines, our regiment lost 191 men, killed and wounded. Severe loss. And we also had 53 of our men captured. Almost all of them were from Company E, which was the other company from Doylestown. So the Doylestown boys in particular took a hit that day, and the Bucks County boys suffered as well. At the end of that year, we were transferred, our whole regiment, to just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. We were actually quite pleased with that because we were going to have a chance to drive it home to the guys that started this war. In spite of the Union blockade, quite a few supplies were getting into Charleston Harbor through the blockade. So in order to complete the siege of Doylestown, we had to shut down that harbor. And the Confederates had built an earthen fort on the south side of that harbor. Thank you. And that fort, together with Fort Sumter in the middle of the harbor, controlled the only shipping channel into the harbor. So if we could take Fort Wagner, we would shut down the harbor. And an earthen fort, you can't break it down with the cannonades. They just bury in the dirt. Basically, the only way at that time you could take an earthen fort was to go up over the top and try to take it with a bayonet before you got shot to pieces. Our first two attempts were rather feeble. Lack of communication at the top mostly. And so on the third attempt, we were reinforced, our brigade, with a brigade of colored soldiers from Massachusetts. This was the first instance of colored troops being used in battle. It was shown in film maybe 20, 25 years ago, a film Glory. Some of you might have seen that film. Starred Morgan Freeman. That brought home how difficult it was to take an earthen fort. Our brigade and the fellows from Massachusetts both got shot up very badly. We suffered a lot of casualties. Had to wait until the dark to go back and retrieve our wounded and dead. We did take the fort on the next attempt, and the 104th was basically stationed there for the rest of their duty tour. Now, Fort Wagner sat on just a big sandbar about 3 feet above sea level at high tide. If you can imagine living on a sandbar for 10 months. One day out of 4, you had to go up and occupy Fort Wagner, which was within cannon range of the artillery on the other side of the harbor. Davis, in his book of the 104th, estimates that about 200 shells a day were dropped into the fort. The other 3 days, you were back on the other part of the sandbar, and Davis, his ingenuity, secured a bake oven for us, and we baked bread. Everybody, all the other units on the sandbar turned in their flour allotment, and for 5 cents we gave them back a fresh loaf of bread, which was a real break for them. At the end of that tour of duty, completed our 3-year enlistment period, and it was shortly after we got back to when we got back to Bucks County. About 3 weeks after we got back, we got a great reception, by the way, if you can imagine, coming back to after 3 years. Great feast. And but a group of the soldiers came to Davis and asked if the funds that we had accumulated, they were regimental funds and amounted to $1,600. They asked if Davis couldn't get permission from the War Department to build a monument in memory of their buddies that we lost. Well, Davis, always close to his troops all during the war, he was a firm leader, but he liked his boys, as he called them. He jumped on that in New York 2nd. He was all for that. He got permission from the War Department to sketched out all of his ideas, what he had in mind for the monument. So the monument itself is basically Davis's idea, and he secured the services of a Philadelphia stonemasonry firm to construct it. The agreed upon price was to be $2,500. The difference between that and the 16 was to be contributed by the residents of Bucks County in either $5 or $10 increments. Construction got started in 1866. It was completed in 1867. When it was completed, it was one of the 3 earliest monuments in the United States to the Civil War monuments. And it was shortly after that the national government designated May 30th of each year to be set aside in memory of the soldiers who lost their lives in the Civil War. It was originally called Decoration Day because people were encouraged to decorate the graves with flowers. Davis thought that the first Memorial Day, which was April 30th, 1868, would be a good occasion to dedicate the monument. And it was a grand and festive occasion. The whole base of the monument was covered with floral arrangements from the local ladies. It was massive floral arrangements. They had a band. The 104th, the men were all back in uniform one more time. And they had a guest speaker, a general from Washington. And at the conclusion of that ceremony, Davis led everyone, band, civilians, audience, in a parade out to his old campgrounds, Camp Lacey. And there they had another ceremony. They formally renamed it in memory of their troops that they'd lost, War Memorial Field. Over the years, that has changed. It was originally dedicated to the soldiers who lost their lives in the Civil War. Today, it is in memory of all soldiers who served in all wars. That changed when Decoration Day, sometime in the mid-20th century, was redesignated as Memorial Day. And Memorial Day also is in memory of all soldiers. who served in the wars. Uh, when the next year rolled around, the people in Doylestown thought that parade was a good idea, so they prevailed upon Davis to organize another one, which he did, and the next year another one, and so forth. It has been held every year since. The route has been changed, but it has become the oldest continuously held Memorial Day parade in the United States, starting on the very first Memorial Day. So in a couple months you can see the 151st edition of that parade, which is a grand and glorious thing. And I can say, if you participate in the parade, you can just feel the community coming together during that parade. It's a great feeling. So that is how the monument came about. And I'm going to divert here and explain a couple things about it, and then if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. The monument itself was originally supposed to be in the cemetery, and there was a miscommunication, delay of back and forth. I can't understand how governments would miscommunicate. But so as a result, it was moved up to the courthouse right at the tip of where the monument is now. There used to be a civilian residence. It was owned by Mr. Ross. So when they proceeded to want to build a monument, the property of Mr. Ross was acquired, and the monument was built where it is today. The monument itself is the property of Doylestown Borough. This is early on. You can see that the rest of the space has not been expanded out. Here it is. The difference in those two pictures is the base has been expanded, and Davis, with the help of a local congressman, secured 4 cannons from the War Department. The War Department, not wanting to send him cannons they were going to use, he found out that the cannons he received were captured Confederate cannons. And that's the reason they're mounted muzzle down into the ground. That's a sign of surrender. But they are Confederate cannons. The shield was added later. Davis on here designates some of the engagements they were in. I think I can read this. Yorktown, Fair Oaks, the battle over here, Fort Wagner, the one I just talked about, and Richmond. The monument, the obelisk itself, is a single piece of Vermont granite, 19 feet high from here to the top, and 15 feet from ground base up to here. I might add, the man, John Struthers and Company, is still in business in Philadelphia, and they weren't just local Philadelphia stonemasons. They did work around a lot of sites in the eastern United States. The one that comes to my memory was on the 100th anniversary of General Washington's birth. They were commissioned to design and build the tombs of George and Martha Washington, which were then, they were reinterred on the grounds of Mount Vernon in Virginia. Other depiction, the original is also in Mercer Museum. This is a depiction of the flag of the 104th Regiment. Our original flag was presented to us by a group of Doylestown ladies when we were in training out in Camp Lacey. This was the standard pattern of the flags at that point in time. 2 concentric circles, star in the center, and 4 stars in the corners of the field. It was that was kept being added to until about 1870 or thereabouts. As more western states started to be added in, they went to the pattern that we see today of rows of stars over here. This flag was always carried by them into action. So you can see, although they took as good a care of it as they did, if you're being shot at and you have cannonballs flying through the air, the flag takes a beating. We have in our Civil War Museum a flag from Wisconsin that was only a 30-star flag because Wisconsin was the 30th state, and it's missing completely one of the stars where a cannonball has gone through the flag and it's shredded at the ends. You see very few original Civil War flags that are not beat up in some fashion. Interestingly enough, I'll just throw this out as a statistic. In that war, of the men who lost their lives, only 1 out of 3 was shot or killed in action. 2 out of 3 died, usually as a result of dysentery or typhoid fever. Those were the big killers. One of the friends of one of our members is an avid quilter, and she's very proficient at it. She likes to quilt, and she presented us with this Civil War era quilt. It's called a Civil War sampler because there are several patterns. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Rick.
You had mentioned that there was collections taken up to fund the balance of the monuments. I heard something about John Wanamaker as one of those.
There is. I oversimplified that for brevity. Yes, John Wanamaker was a very close friend of Davis. When they were camped out at Camp Lacey for 6 weeks, the organizing officer is responsible for all supplies to the regiment. You've got 1,000 guys for 6 weeks. They eat up a little food. But John Wanamaker was a staunch supporter of the Union effort in the war. He was a close friend of Davis, and he helped him out considerably. At the end of the war, Mr. Wanamaker contributed, I think, $100 towards that difference, as did Davis's commanding officer, Henry Nagley, and the balance was made up of, and didn't turn out to be exactly $2,500, as no contract does. It was closer to $2,900 by the end. But the citizens of Bucks County all pitched in.
Didn't the soldiers contribute also?
They contributed their regimental funds that they had accumulated during the course of the war, $1,600. The 104th losing 150 men, I'd just like to put that in perspective a little bit, because in recent years we've had the Wall of Honor, which used to be in the courthouse and now has been moved back around the corner there. But the population of Bucks County at that time was only 1/10 of what it is today. So in relative ratios, that would be the equivalent today of losing 1,500 men from Bucks County. Staggering losses. And later on in the war, there were large parts of 2 other regiments formed within Bucks County who also suffered losses. So the total county losses were closer to 250, which would be 2,500 men in today's society. 2,500 men from Bucks County. Just think about that for a minute. It's staggering losses. And not only that, but we have over in our museum a picture of the 75th reunion of the Battle of Gettysburg, when all of the survivors, and there were still 1,700 survivors north and south, all got together. And at least a third of those guys were missing either an arm or a leg. So over and above the deaths, there were many, many soldiers who lived the rest of their lives with severe handicaps. Somebody else had their hand up.
Is there any significance to the star pattern?
No, that's just the way it started out. It started out originally as 13
Sure.
stars, if you remember, when Betsy Ross made the flag. You must remember Betsy Ross.
Yeah.
As the circle got bigger, they realized, okay, so then they had 2 circles, and then after the Civil War, they realized this could only go so far, and that's when they went to the stripes. But no, they were.
Just thought it was interesting. They had the 1 star in the middle and then the 4 points, at the corners.
Yeah. They used to have an annual celebration down there, and this is one of those celebrations. This, which is called the new courthouse at that time, that courthouse was built in 1878. So we believe that this was probably 88 or some significant holiday, Memorial Day after that. But all of those ceremonies, they had the band, the soldiers. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your attention. And,